You are watching part 4 of The Beach Boys on Pop Goes the 60s. The year 1966 was perhaps the most creative year of Brian Wilson's life, and the Beach Boys completed both Pet Sounds and Good Vibrations, and they started working on the tracks that was to be the album SMiLE. Now the SMiLE project was really a blending of those two earlier projects, the symphonic sound and production style of Pet Sounds, combined with the new modular style that Brian employed on Good Vibrations. The success of Good Vibrations put the Beach Boys out in front of the Beatles in several polls, and the accolades that Brian got encouraged him to continue on this modular approach. Now, he had already started working on some of the songs by the time Good Vibrations came out, and his plan was to utilize session players like he did on Pet Sounds and bringing in another lyricist. The success of Good Vibrations inspired me to keep moving in that same direction, but unfortunately he felt like a misfit. He said that he felt like he was not part of society. I had it in my mind that I was a square, and he started to push for enlightenment. July of '66 was a relatively quiet month for Brian as he took some time off from the studio while the band toured. Pet Sounds was a much bigger success than reported as the sheer number of counterculture figures started to flock around Brian, as his wife explained. People wanted to be around Brian and get a part of what he had. Now, out of these enlightened people, we've already mentioned Lawrence Schwartz. He was the guy that gave Brian his first dose of LSD in 1965. Also in this bunch was lyricist Tony Asher. Now, Asher and Schwartz were best pals at Santa Monica College. Another school friend of Schwartz's was a guy named David Anderle. Anderle was a kind of a growing character on the underground LA scene. He was an A&R man, and he was known as the mayor of hip. So anybody with a name like that really needs no further introduction. Although he did represent some other artists, one of which was Van Dyke Parks. Van Dyke Parks had a growing reputation on the pop scene. He played piano, clarinet, guitar. He was a child actor in the mid-50s and had a role in The Swan starring Grace Kelly. And he also had a recurring role as Little Tommy Manicotti on The Honeymooners. Parks majored in music at Carnegie Institute, where he studied with Aaron Copland. He joined his brother Carson and future producer Rick Gerard in a folk group. He arranged the bare necessities for Disney's Jungle Book. Along with Steve Stills and Steve Young, he opened for Love and Spoonful. He gave his song High Coin to the Charlatans and Harper's Bazaar. He refused an invitation by David Crosby to join the Byrds, and he played briefly with Frank Zappa's Mothers of Invention. So this guy got around a lot, and through it all, he developed a healthy aversion to Anglophilia and anything British.
Aus Elysium, wir betreten feuertrunken.
Van Dyke Parks was introduced to Brian Wilson through Terry Melcher and David Crosby. And when Brian was talking to him, he really loved his command of the language and asked him if he wrote lyrics. Here's what Parks said. Wilson sought me out after he had heard about me through mutual friends. People who experimented with psychedelics, no matter who they were viewed as enlightened people, and Brian sought out the enlightened people. During the summer of '66, several other enlightened people were added to Brian's coterie of individuals. It was Van Dyke Parks who had introduced Brian Wilson to Derek Taylor, and Anderle brought in several other writers, like college friend and magazine reporter Mike Vossi. Jules Siegel, who wrote for the Saturday Evening Post, was invited in, and he had written an article on Dylan that really established Dylan's credentials on the West Coast, and that was in the Saturday Evening Post. Finally, Danny Hutton, later of Three Dog Night, who was also represented by Anderle, joined the inner circle. This enlightened coterie temporarily replaced the actual Beach Boys as Brian's main collaborators for the beginning of the SMiLE project. As Anderle explained, SMiLE was going to be a monument. That's the way we talked about it, as a monument. In August, Brian started writing several new songs, and he was finishing up Good Vibrations, and it still needed some lyrics, and he asked Van Dyke Parks about it, but Parks declined, feeling the song was pretty much already done. Now, what he did add, what Parks did suggest for Good Vibrations, was the use of cello, and that impressed Brian, and that led to him being invited to be the lyricist for the next album. Bringing in a lyricist by Brian went against the agreement he had with Mike Love, and Mike was expecting to regain his role as lyricist after the Pet Sounds album, where he was replaced by Tony Asher, and Brian promised that originally that it would only be for one album, where he would bring in an outside writer. And they shook on that, and unfortunately for Mike, Brian reneged on that deal. Now, Mike could not have taken this very well because He had just come off of writing lyrics for Good Vibrations, which was the band's biggest hit of all time, so he probably felt, well, he had proven himself, and here Brian decides to use a different lyricist. On top of this, Mike Love had still never received any royalties for all his writing in the early part of the Beach Boys' career, and this was just one of those issues that was never resolved and continued to fester. The working title for this album originally was called Dumb Angel, but they changed it to SMiLE early on. And by September, the Beach Boys, who weren't touring much that month, were starting to lay down vocals on some of the new tracks.
She laughs and stays in the one wonderful.
According to Van Dyke Park, SMiLE was originally intended to reclaim popular music from the British influence of acts like the Beatles, and he wanted to investigate early Americana.
Rock, rock, roll, Plymouth Rock, roll over.
September was a super productive month as lyrics were being added and songs started to quickly take shape. They even hired an artist to start working on the artwork for the album, in Frank Holmes. By October 1966, Good Vibrations was released, and with the acclaim that came with that, Brian had intended to continue work on that modular style, and the main song he was focusing on for that was Heroes and Villains. And this was easily the most complex of the new songs that he was working on.
I've been in this town so long that back in the city I've been taken for lost and gone and unknown for a long.
Employing multiple studios, Brian hired more and more session musicians to create the basic tracks. Now at home, he also wanted a creative atmosphere, so he started bringing in certain things. He brought a sandbox in the dining room and put his piano right in the middle of it. He had this big Arabian tent that he brought into the living room. And then he also had these blue exercise mats for whenever the guys wanted to take a tumble.
Hanging down from my window, those are my wind chimes.
The SMiLE session started to go beyond making an album and became a way of living for Brian and his entourage. And the making of music started to blend with living life. Questions came up on how they were going to perform these songs live, and some of it was answered when they did a version of Good Vibrations live in Michigan. Now this was only the second time they played it live, so it was a little bit shaky, and Brian was there to supervise it. And at the end of the show, they invited Brian on stage and he joined them for a wild encore. By November, Good Vibrations was a worldwide smash, and Brian continued to record through the end of the month of October. And it was about this time where the band started a European tour that would take them through most of November. All the hoopla surrounding Good Vibrations started to spread into the underground in Los Angeles, and this mystique around the album SMiLE began to grow. And the Brian Wilson is a Genius campaign really started to hit America here, but it really hit in the underground first, as more and more writers were invited into this inner circle. Guys like Paul J. Robbins of the LA Free Press, Richard Goldstein of The Village Voice, Paul Williams, founder and editor of Crawdaddy. But the most significant person that took notice was David Oppenheim, who was producing a show called Inside Pop, The Rock Revolution. It was a TV documentary, and the original idea of that was to focus on Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys. As I said, this swell of mystique was happening around SMiLE, so there was an interview set up to go interview Brian at his house in Laurel Canyon. And this is what Oppenheim said. It was a strange, insulated household, insulated from the world by money, a playpen of irresponsible people. So an interview was attempted, but Brian, they couldn't get much out of him. So they left it at that, and they did record one very special song that was one of the centerpieces of the SMiLE project.
Here is a new song, too complex to get all of first time around. It could come only out of the ferment that characterizes today's pop music scene. Brian Wilson leader of the famous Beach Boys and one of today's most important pop musicians, sings his own Surf's Up.
The lyrics to Surf's Up were rather poignant, as Van Dyke Parks explained that they were partly inspired from the return trip from the Beach Boys UK tour, where they were laughed at by audiences for wearing the striped shirts and looking so out of place and out of step with, I guess, what you'd say the counterculture, or even just pop culture. David Oppenheim was not the only one to see something odd going on in Brian Wilson's home. When the Beach Boys were touring, Brian started to become paranoid. He started to have meetings in pools, and he started to cancel sessions due to bad vibes, and he was constantly changing his mind. In one very strange moment, Brian was going to a movie. He was watching the movie Seconds, a psychological horror film, and as he walked into the movie, one of the actors says, "Welcome, Mr. Wilson." And this really freaked him out. He thought that this was aimed directly at him, and he blamed Phil Spector's Mind Gangsters for causing this. And Spector, I think, had actually financed part of the film, so the Spector thing was still eating at him as he went from really worshiping him to now being completely paranoid about what Spector was trying to do to him. Things started to unravel more for Brian, but this time in the studio when he was recording the part of the Elements called Fire. And for this recording, he had everybody wearing fire helmets. He was bringing wood in and burning it in a pail so it smelled of smoke. And things were getting really crazy. This track was recorded November 28th at Gold Star, and it's very dark and very, very demonic, actually. And Brian had found out that the following day there was a building that burned down, apparently across the street. And he started to look at the other buildings in the neighborhood that had burned down recently, and he thought that he was responsible for it, like he was creating musical witchcraft. Now, Van Dyke Parks was concerned right around this time, and he said, "It was clear to me perhaps before anyone else that Brian was moving toward an emotional collapse. I avoided the fire sessions like the plague. I thought it was regressive behavior." So this is the time Van Dyke Parks left the sessions. He felt his work was done at this point. I think they only had done about 7 songs lyrically, so I'm not sure why he thought it was done, but maybe he didn't want to deal with what was going on with Brian Wilson. So David Andley chipped in that the Elements recording was one of the biggest parts of the demise of the project, and that was Brian Wilson beginning to encounter resistance in the studio, namely with engineers and booking studio time. Brian Wilson was getting a reputation for doing a lot of super late nights into the morning. He was doing take after take, and he was never satisfied. So this started to rankle some of the session players. After a short period of time, Van Dyke Parks was brought back into the sessions, but really not as a writer at this point, but to settle some arguments over what his lyrics meant. Now, Mike Love had been questioning the lyrics, and he was very sensitive to any drug-induced lyrics. He didn't want to promote drugs, and he was questioning the line, "Over and over the crow cries uncover the cornfield." Now, this is the song Cabinescence, and Mike wanted to understand what these lyrics meant, and he was asking Van Dyke Parks, and Parks said, "Well, they really don't have any meaning. So, Mike, if you don't like them, you guys can take them out." Now, one of the things that I want to point out here is that Mike Love, he wasn't into the drug references in the music for sure. And one of the things that I think made him on edge was this entourage of Brian's that were very much into drugs. So this was very common. The enlightenment of the LSD, but mostly a lot of marijuana and amphetamine that they were taking. So they were in their own little world. And I think Mike had a problem with that coming to some of these sessions or some of the writing sessions at the house. And the second thing was that Mike, he probably had some resentment toward Van Dyke Parks because Van Dyke Parks took his place as the lyricist. And that was the thing Mike had expected to be doing on this album. I can see Mike Love's perspective on this and not being very happy with Van Dyke Parks and pressuring him to explain the lyrics, but Parks handled it pretty well, and none of the lyrics were changed, and Mike Love and the rest of the Beach Boys sang the songs as written. Since working on the Fire track, things started to slow down in the studio, but by December, Brian had delivered a handwritten track listing to Capitol, who was getting a little antsy for product. and they realized it wasn't going to be ready for Christmas. But what they did do is they jumped the gun a little bit by promoting the album for a January release.
SMiLE is the name of the new Beach Boys album, which will be released in January 1967. And with the happy album cover, the really happy sounds inside, and a happy in-store display piece, you can't miss. We're sure to sell 1 million units in January.
Now here's the album and the artwork, and Capitol actually printed over 400,000 of these covers. And talk about jumping the gun. And they just came off a bad incident a few months earlier with the Beatles Yesterday and Today, having to scrap those albums or put a cover over them. There was a booklet also that came with it with pictures those were also printed. So that was all for nothing, at least temporarily, as the January deadline came and went. The word on the street was that the album only needed some additional lyrics and vocals to complete it. Nonetheless, Capitol held off releasing anything, either the album or promoting the new single, which was Heroes and Villains, until March. Now, one of the reasons David Anderle was put on the payroll initially was to broker a deal to create a new record label for the Beach Boys. This was going to be called Brother Records. And at this point, they were thinking of leaving Capitol and releasing their own record on their own label. So Brian wanted that to be a big splash. So he started working on Heroes and Villains for that to be the first single on Brother Records. Now this is where things started to come unraveled. He was already, from the Fire sessions, he was already starting to behave strangely. And when it came time to working on Heroes and Villains again, which was thought to be somewhat finished, he started to take chunks out of other songs that were already recorded, fitting them into Heroes and Villains. And what happened is he started to dismantle some of the songs that they had been recording the last few months. So as he started dismantling the album to serve the single, the brothers, particularly Carl, realized that Brian was not well. And at this point, Carl and Dennis went into the studio to record some tracks of their own. Now these two songs may have been an attempt to help complete SMiLE, or I'm not sure what exactly. It's never really been determined, but Van Dyke Parks was still around and he was there presumably to help make sense of these recordings, but there probably wasn't a whole lot he could do if Brian was going to start chunking out parts of these finished songs. Now one other thing that happened around this time was David Anderle, who was also a painter, had secretly been painting this portrait of Brian, and he presented it to Brian. And it was really disturbing to Brian because he thought it literally captured his soul. It's an incredible painting, but it looks very disturbing and dark to me. And for some reason, Brian just had a real problem with it. And his relationship with Anderle was never the same. Now, making matters even worse for the band is Carl was arrested for not registering for the Vietnam draft. And he filed as a conscientious objector, but that took some time to get that worked out, and he had gotten arrested. By February 1967, the Beach Boys sued Capitol Records. This was part of them starting their new label, and they were getting their books in order, and they discovered some unpaid royalties. Now, you may remember from my last video, there was talk of the album Pet Sounds hitting 500,000 copies. That's a gold record status by the end of 1966. Well, part of the reason that people didn't know about that is because Capitol did not certify it gold. So I'm not sure if this was part of them cooking the books a little bit here or what, but something was not right, and the Beach Boys were going to get to the bottom of it. The problem was that once this lawsuit started, Capitol halted anything or any releases of the Beach Boys. So SMiLE came to a halt at this point because of this lawsuit. Now, for those of you who are big Beatle fans, may know that in the 70s, the Beatles had to sue Capitol Records for something similar. So albums that were sold that were not paid for, supposedly maybe they were scrapped or something, but there was always this untrustfulness of how Capitol did business, particularly with back catalogs and paying royalties. Now, through all this, Brian kept recording Heroes and Villains, and he decided at some point that they had to start over from square one. So he basically started re-recording the whole thing, and he had months invested into this song already, And even the session players started losing patience. It was very typical for Brian to go take them through several takes to say, it's perfect, let's do it again. And this would drive the session players crazy, because if it was perfect, why do we have to do it again? So it was around this time, late February, I suppose, that Brian heard the song Strawberry Fields Forever on the car radio. And he pulled the car over, and he was on Seconal at the time, so he was not in his right mind, but he said he had never heard anything like that before, and he questioned whether the Beatles had beat them to the punch or not. With the album delayed several times, this put Derek Taylor in a tight spot where he had to spin, saying that, oh, Brian is this perfectionist, we want it to be right and be perfect before it comes out, and here it's not coming out, it's starting to devolve, in fact. Al Jardine said, well, Capitol didn't like what they heard so far, and Brian said that we were taking too many drugs and couldn't concentrate. We got so stoned and we couldn't unstone ourselves. Now, by March of '67, Brian did an about-face with Heroes and Villains, and he wanted to have another song be the lead single from SMiLE, and that was the song Vegetables. And David Anderle had reported that there was creative differences happening between him and Van Dyke Parks. And here's what Van Dyke Parks said. I didn't want Vegetables to be given too much emphasis. For SMiLE, that celebrated collaboration, to be dependent on a commercial release of Vegetables as a single was to me tremendously ill-advised. And Parks leaves for a second time. It was also in March that Brian became estranged from his enlightened coterie. Back in August, September, October, everything was going so smoothly. So much progress was being made, everybody was having a great time, and things were moving fast. But after November, things just changed drastically, and all these people started to fall away. Jules Siegel, the writer, he was barred from entering the studio or hanging with Brian because Brian thought his girlfriend was a witch and was using ESP to mess up his mind. David Anderle, the last time he tried to get together with Brian to talk business, Brian wouldn't come out of the bedroom. So these things were going on. Michael Vossi also left. Van Dyke Parks had signed a solo deal for an album with Warner Brothers, so he was gone by this time as well. Now, a break arrived for Brian and Marilyn, that is, when they bought a new house in Bel Air. They bought a house next door to Michelle and John Phillips of the Mamas and Papas. And I think this was, I think Marilyn saw this as an opportunity to get him away from all these people that brought all the drugs to him. And this house was much more secluded. It wasn't as easy to get to and just walk right into. And Brian built a studio there. Now, Marilyn felt this would be a new start for him and give him a new outlook on SMiLE. In April, Brian continued working on the song Vegetables, and Paul McCartney even dropped by to attend a session. And he and the group were still working on several songs, finishing up SMiLE, or so they thought. The show Inside Pop, The Rock Revolution airs, but the Beach Boys hadn't released anything in 6 months. So this was supposed to be largely on the Beach Boys, but they just had a small part in it, or at least Brian did, and is because he was acting strangely when they were interviewing him. So all these months later, he plays Surf's Up. This is played in April of '67, and there's no SMiLE album to go with it. So in England, EMI, they released a single without the Beach Boys' consent, and they released the song, Then I Kissed Her. This was a cover song. This is a Phil Spector song, completely out of sync with what the band was doing. Brian was interviewed in Tiger Beat magazine in 1967 saying, I feel like I've lost my talent. I'm working harder and getting less satisfaction than ever before. Now things were about to get worse. The Beach Boys were scheduled to headline at the Monterey Pop Festival. They were going to close the Saturday night show. Now, on April 29th, Derek Taylor announced in Disc and Music Echo that, quote, all the 12 songs for the new Beach Boys albums are completed, and there are plans to release the album on a rush schedule any moment. Now, I don't know where he got that information, because 1 week later, he announced that the album had been scrapped by Wilson. Now, the unfortunate part about this is that Brian Wilson was not aware that this announcement was being made. So how's that for a PR guy? On top of it, the Beach Boys were touring in Amsterdam, and they were expecting a mid-May release of the album. So this is how they found out. 20 days after the announcement that the album was being scrapped, Sgt. Pepper was released. And you just couldn't get worse timing than that, really. So this is the Summer of Love, so-called, where Sgt. Pepper just took over the talk of all popular music. And this really could have been SMiLE a couple of months earlier. Had it been released on time, would have garnered some of those headlines, I have to believe. Now in June, very early June, is when we had the Monterey Pop Festival, and the Beach Boys backed out at the last minute. And Lou Adler, who was one of the organizers, he couldn't believe it. And one of the problems that they faced, they thought that Carl Wilson might get arrested on stage. You know, Dennis was going through a divorce. You know, Brian was having all kinds of problems. So it just was the timing for them. They were just exhausted, and they got cold feet and they pulled out. Now, if I was the PR guy, if I'm Derek Taylor, what he didn't understand is that Carl Wilson getting arrested at Monterey would have been perfect for their image. So that's how they were thinking. Dennis Wilson was even concerned, as was Brian, about losing their old audience, thinking that maybe they had gone too far with SMiLE. So that started to creep in, and they didn't want to lose, I guess, their old fans. So Derek Taylor recalled, they were certainly very heavily criticized at the time for their cancellation at Monterey. It seemed in a way rather like an admission of defeat. Now in hindsight, Monterey was a turning point in rock music, and Pepper had just come out, and this is when harder rock and the outdoor concert really took off. And the withdrawal was seen as further distancing itself from the counterculture. And Jan Wenner of Rolling Stone was not afraid to put that in print either. So that made the Beach Boys look bad. It made them look like they were has-beens, and they weren't really with it. Now, even by Monterey, they probably could have salvaged SMiLE if they could have garnered up the balls to play the concert and maybe played a few songs from it, or given the album away at the concert. I think that would have been a great thing. They may have righted the ship, but they just did a complete fold. As I always say, the Beach Boys go as Brian Wilson goes. This has to be considered one of the biggest collapses in pop history. And just when you think things couldn't get worse, they do. Well, they still had a single to release, and that was Heroes and Villains. And they were still working on that, and Brian was actually holding it back. And he was holding it back to release on a special date. And this date coincided with the dates that he was being told by his astrologers to release it just at the right time. So what they did was they, unannounced, they went to a radio, they went to KHJ Radio in Los Angeles. And he was accompanied by Terry Melcher. They go up in their limo, and they're giving the radio station an exclusive to play Heroes and Villains, only to be told that, well, I can't do that because it's not on the programming list. So after some frantic calls, they get some big boss on the phone and they say, play it, play it. So they did play it, but it was like nobody really, there was nothing about it that really created any waves at all. And it completely deflated Brian. On December 14th, 1967, Jan Wenner printed an influential piece in Rolling Stone magazine that denounced the Genius label, which he called a promotional shuck, and a pointless attempt to compare Wilson with the Beatles. He wrote, Wilson believed that he was a genius and felt obligated to make good of it. It left Wilson in a bind. As a result of the article, many rock fans excluded the group from serious consideration. And that kind of continued to plague the Beach Boys for several years. I'm going to stop here, but I have more to come on the legend and the myth of SMiLE, so stay tuned. Now, the period that comes right after SMiLE, many consider to be the Beach Boys' most fertile period, even though they weren't having any hits. So that'll be the focus of the next Beach Boys video. Now, before we leave, I want to talk a little bit about the album, because most fans, much of this stuff wasn't released. Some of these songs were released in subsequent albums. I'm going to talk about that in the next video installment. But most fans had to rely on bootlegs. And some very good bootlegs started coming out in the 80s. But then the 1993 box set released several of these songs that were never before heard. They were legitimately released. And then Brian Wilson did a solo version of it live called Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE. And this was an expanded version of it. It wasn't meant to be how it was going to be released in 1967, but it gave fans a complete way to hear the music. That was so successful and popular that they released the SMiLE Sessions. Now this is a 2-disc album of those sessions. Now the original album was only supposed to be 1 disc. So probably about 38, 40 minutes worth of music. And since it was never compiled, nobody's sure how it would go. Although some people have some pretty good ideas where some of the songs would have turned up. Well, the SMiLE Sessions was released in a 5-disc set. So there's all kinds of little snippets and pieces of things you can hear that Brian was working on. And how they could have fit into SMiLE is anybody's guess. And one of the things I want to mention here is that if I had never heard of the troubles of this album that was unreleased, and I heard a fan mix of this album, a really good one, I never would have thought this album was unfinished. That's how close they were. Now, some say they were about 80% done because there are some vocals and some lyrics that were never completed. But to my ears, what is now instrumental, some small instrumental passages in this album, it sounds perfectly normal and natural. Pet Sounds had instrumentals, so when I heard it, I never thought that those spots needed vocals. So I would say that this album is probably more complete than maybe Brian Wilson even realized. He just had so many extra parts, he didn't have room to fit them and didn't know where to fit them. So I can see how that would have been confusing. And as you can see, things just gradually ground to a halt, and there are many reasons why this album did not happen. And I'm going to be talking about some of those reasons in a follow-up video. So I think that if you listen to any of the fan mixes out there, that you will find this album fairly complete sounding. And that might be a naive take if you don't know all the history, but it's good enough for me. Now, if you haven't heard a fan mix, I'm going to provide one for you to listen to on my podcast, and I'll put the link below. It'll be a 40-minute single disc version, and it'll hit all the highlights. That's all for now. Now, if you like the work I do and want to contribute to this channel in a bigger way, I do have a Patreon subscription you can jump on. And one of the things you get if you are a Patreon subscriber, there are certain giveaways I give you, but there's also raffles. And I've got 3 Beach Boys albums that never were that are going to be raffled off sometime very soon. And I'm going to showcase those in the next Part 5 video of the Beach Boys here on Pop Goes the 60s, so you won't want to miss it.